The whisper came on a Tuesday evening, soft as silk, but sharp as broken glass, cutting through the summer air between our backyards where fireflies danced oblivious to the darkness forming. James Holloway stood too close, his breath warm against my ear, his hand trembling as it briefly touched my shoulder with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. "I wish I had married you, Claire," he said, and the words hung there like a noose, swaying in the twilight, while his eyes searched mine for something I couldn't name. I stepped back, forcing a nervous laugh, trying to dismiss it as the ramblings of a man who'd had too much whiskey, but my heart hammered against my ribs with a primal warning. His wife, Margaret, had been gone for 3 days, and suddenly those words felt less like a confession and more like a eulogy. The Holloways had moved in next door 2 years ago, a picture-perfect couple with their matching gardening gloves and Sunday morning pancake traditions that wafted through my kitchen window. Margaret was warm, the kind of woman who brought over casseroles and remembered your birthday, while James seemed quieter, always watching from the corners of rooms with eyes that held secrets. Their marriage appeared seamless from the outside, but I'd heard the arguments through thin walls, the sharp crescendo of Margaret's voice followed by his low, dangerous murmur that made the air feel heavy. Now she was gone, vanished without explanation, and James stood in my yard acting as though nothing had shattered, as though the absence of his wife was merely an inconvenience. The neighborhood whispered theories over coffee and concerned glances, but no one dared voice what we all feared in the darkest corners of our minds. I couldn't sleep that night, James's words replaying in an endless loop, while shadows danced across my ceiling, like accusations pointing downward. My house felt too close to his, the shared fence between our properties suddenly seeming paper-thin, inadequate protection against whatever truth festered next door. Every creak of settling wood made me jump. Every distant siren made me wonder if someone else had noticed what I'd begun to suspect, but couldn't yet articulate. The rational part of my brain insisted I was overreacting, that Margaret had probably left him, run away to start fresh somewhere far from this suffocating suburban existence. But the whisper kept returning. "Wish I had married you," and with it came images I couldn't unsee, possibilities I couldn't unthink, questions that grew teeth in the darkness. Morning brought no relief, only harsh sunlight that exposed the neglect creeping into James's once pristine yard, the wilting roses Margaret had tended with such devotion now brown and forgotten. I watched from my kitchen window as he emerged, barefoot and disheveled, moving through his morning routine with mechanical precision that suggested autopilot rather than consciousness. He watered the front lawn but avoided the backyard entirely, his gaze sliding past the shed where gardening tools hung on rusty nails like instruments of some unspoken purpose. The mailman delivered a stack of envelopes, and James accepted them with a smile that never reached his eyes, his performance of normalcy so practiced it felt rehearsed. I turned away, nausea rising in my throat, wondering how long I could pretend I hadn't noticed the wrongness seeping through every interaction. The smell started on Thursday, faint at first, easily dismissed as a dead animal caught somewhere in the late summer heat that pressed down on our small Michigan town. By Friday afternoon it had grown stronger, thick and unmistakable, the sweet rot of decay that turned stomachs and sent neighbors closing windows despite the sweltering temperatures. I stood at the fence line between our properties, hand covering my nose, eyes fixed on the wooden shed that sat squat and silent in the far corner of James's yard. Something dark stained the earth near its foundation, the soil disturbed and freshly turned, despite the drought that had left the rest of the lawn cracked and yellowing. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, the 3 digits I should dial burning against my leg with the weight of accusation, but fear held me frozen, suspended between knowing and proving, between suspicion and certainty. The police arrived Saturday morning in unmarked cars, their casual approach suggesting a wellness check rather than the investigation it would become, their faces still relaxed before everything changed. Detective Sarah Martinez knocked on my door first, her dark eyes kind but sharp, the kind of gaze that missed nothing and forgot less, reading the tremor in my hands as I clutched my coffee mug. I told her everything, the whisper, the smell, the wrongness that had infected the air between our houses like poison spreading through groundwater. She listened without judgment, taking notes in small, Precise handwriting that somehow made my suspicions feel validated rather than paranoid. Legitimate rather than the ramblings of an anxious woman who'd watched too many crime documentaries. When I finished, she thanked me with a gravity that suggested she'd heard the same story before. In different words, from different witnesses who'd all waited just a little too long to speak. James answered his door wearing yesterday's clothes, his hair uncombed, his expression shifting from surprise to concern, to something darker that flickered and died behind his eyes. I watched from my living room window, hidden behind sheer curtains that allowed observation without exposure, my heart racing as Martinez and her partner engaged him in conversation. He gestured animatedly, his body language open and cooperative, but his hands moved too much, betraying nervousness that contradicted his calm voice. They asked about Margaret, about the smell, about the shed, and with each question his smile grew tighter, more strained, like fabric stretched too thin across something sharp underneath. He let them into his backyard without hesitation, either confident in his innocence or arrogant in his belief that he'd covered his tracks well enough to withstand scrutiny. The excavation began within hours, after cadaver dogs alerted near the shed with behavior that sent ice through my veins even from a distance. Yellow crime scene tape transformed James's backyard into something foreign, a movie set rather than the place where we'd shared awkward waves and small talk about weather and sports. Shovels broke earth with rhythmic precision, each scoop revealing darker soil beneath, layer after layer of secrets being peeled back under the merciless afternoon sun. Neighbors gathered on the street, a crowd forming like witnesses to an execution, phones out and recording, everyone suddenly remembering small details that had seemed innocent before, but now carried sinister weight. I stood among them but apart, the woman who'd heard the whisper, the one who'd known first, marked by proximity to horror that would redefine this quiet street forever. They found her before sunset, Margaret's body wrapped in plastic sheeting that had failed to contain what death had wrought, her remains curled in a makeshift grave that spoke of hurried burial and desperate concealment. The sound that went up from the crowd was primal, a collective gasp that acknowledged we'd crossed from speculation into confirmation, from hoping we were wrong into facing that we'd been right all along. Martinez emerged from the backyard with her jaw set, her eyes harder than they'd been that morning, and I knew she'd seen things that would follow her home and into her dreams. James was already in handcuffs by then, led to a patrol car with his head down, no longer performing normalcy, because the audience had finally seen through the act. I watched him go. This man who'd wished he'd married me, and wondered how many times he'd rehearsed those words before delivering them with such devastating tenderness. The media descended like locusts, their vans lining our street with satellite dishes reaching toward clouds that had finally broken to release rain that felt like tears for a woman we'd failed to save. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone willing to talk, transforming tragedy into content, grief into headlines, our neighborhood into a cautionary tale about the monsters who hide behind manicured lawns and friendly waves. I declined every interview, my involvement already too deep, my name already appearing in police reports as the witness whose suspicion had cracked the case wide open. That night, I sat in my darkened living room, staring at the empty house next door, where crime scene lights still flickered like ghosts, and replayed every interaction I'd had with James and Margaret, searching for signs I'd missed, warnings I'd ignored. The whisper returned to haunt me. Wish I had married you. And I finally understood it wasn't a confession of affection, but a claim of ownership. A chilling declaration from a man who believed he could simply replace one woman with another, once the first became inconvenient. The autopsy revealed Margaret had been dead for 5 days when they found her, killed by blunt force trauma to the back of her skull that suggested spontaneous violence rather than premeditation, rage rather than planning. Detective Martinez shared this with me during a follow-up interview at the station. Her voice professional, but her eyes showing the wear of a woman who'd seen too much darkness. Margaret had died in their kitchen, the forensics team finding traces of blood beneath freshly scrubbed tiles, evidence that James had tried to erase what he'd done with bleach and desperation. He'd struck her during an argument, the neighbors confirmed. They'd heard raised voices that Tuesday afternoon, but the sounds had stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, no one had thought to check, to knock, to insist that everything was all right. I listened to these details, feeling the weight of collective guilt, understanding that we'd all been complicit in our indifference. choosing comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable involvement. James's confession came easier than anyone expected, his lawyer's objections overridden by a need to explain, to justify, to make us understand the logic that had seemed so clear in his fractured mind. He described Margaret as difficult, demanding, never satisfied with what he provided or who he was, her criticism eroding his sense of self until something inside him finally snapped. The argument had started over something trivial, dinner plans or unpaid bills, the kind of domestic friction that flares and fades in healthy relationships, but exploded into violence in theirs. He claimed he didn't mean to kill her, that the blow had been reflexive, defensive, though the forensics suggested otherwise with its evidence of multiple strikes and sustained force. After she fell, he'd panicked, dragging her body to the shed under cover of darkness, digging the grave with the same shovel she'd used to plant her roses, burying her among the flowers she'd loved while I slept soundly just beyond the fence. The whisper made sense now in its grotesque way. James had convinced himself that I represented everything Margaret wasn't. Quiet where she was loud, compliant where she was defiant, a blank canvas onto which he could project his fantasy of the perfect wife. He'd watched me through windows and across yards, studying my routines, imagining a life where he'd made a different choice, where he'd married someone easier to control. His confession to me hadn't been romantic but transactional, testing whether I might fill the vacancy he'd created, whether I'd accept the position of Mrs. Holloway now that the previous occupant had been permanently terminated. The presumption was staggering, the narcissism breathtaking, this belief that he could murder his wife and seamlessly insert a replacement as though human beings were interchangeable parts in the machine of his comfort. I felt violated by his assumptions, sickened by the role he'd cast me in without my knowledge or consent, the script he'd been writing where I existed only as a supporting character in his disturbed narrative. The trial became a media spectacle, cameras capturing every moment of James's calculated remorse, his tearful testimony that rang hollow to anyone who'd seen the crime scene photos or heard the forensic evidence. His defense argued heat of passion, temporary insanity, any narrative that might reduce his culpability from murder to manslaughter, from monster to simply a man pushed too far. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a controlling husband who'd systematically isolated his wife, monitoring her phone calls, limiting her friendships, creating conditions where she existed only in relation to him. Witnesses testified about bruises Margaret had explained away, about her growing withdrawal from social activities, about the fear that had lived in her eyes during those final months. I took the stand and recounted the whisper, watching James's face as I spoke, seeing no recognition of wrongdoing there, only irritation that his plan had been disrupted, that I'd proven less cooperative than he'd hoped. The guilty verdict came after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury's faces somber as they delivered judgment that would send James Holloway to prison for life without possibility of parole. I watched from the gallery as he received the sentence with shocking composure. No tears, no outburst, just a slight nod as though acknowledging an expected outcome, already adapting to his new circumstances. Margaret's family wept with relief mixed with grief, their daughter and sister finally avenged but never to be returned. Justice served but insufficient to fill the void she'd left. As they led James away in chains, he turned once more to look at me. And in that final glance I saw not apology but entitlement, a man still convinced he'd been wronged by circumstances rather than destroyed by his own violence. I held his gaze without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my fear. And when he finally looked away, I felt something release in my chest, the first full breath I'd taken since that Tuesday evening, when he'd whispered words that would haunt me forever. The house next door stayed empty for months, its windows dark and accusing, a monument to tragedy that repelled potential buyers who'd read the headlines and felt the lingering chill. Real estate agents scrubbed the listing of any mention of the Holloways, but in the age of internet searches and crime databases, anonymity was impossible, the address forever marked by what had happened there. I watched for sale signs appear and disappear, each price reduction an acknowledgement that some stains can't be removed with fresh paint and new carpets. The yard grew wild without Margaret's careful tending, her roses becoming thorny tangles that seemed to reach toward my fence like accusations, reminding me daily of the woman who'd smiled over coffee and died alone. The shed remained, though someone had painted over the door, as if a new coat of white could erase the darkness that had been stored inside. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My nights filled with dreams where I heard Margaret calling from beneath the earth, asking why I hadn't noticed sooner, why I hadn't saved her. I'd wake drenched in sweat, gasping, my bedroom feeling too similar to hers in layout and dimension, the walls too thin to stop violence from bleeding through. Therapy helped, Dr. Chen's calm presence and practical tools giving me frameworks to process trauma that wasn't even mine, except by proximity, except by the chance of geography that had placed me next to a killer. She explained survivor's guilt, secondary trauma, the weight of witnessing horror even at a remove, validating feelings I'd tried to dismiss as dramatic or self-indulgent. But knowledge didn't stop the nightmares. Understanding didn't silence Margaret's voice echoing through my subconscious, asking questions I couldn't answer. The neighborhood changed after the trial, our small community losing its innocence. That comfortable assumption that bad things happened elsewhere, to other people, in rougher towns with less manicured lawns. Neighbors who'd been friendly became suspicious, watchful, everyone suddenly aware of how little we actually knew about the people living behind closed doors. Block parties stopped, that casual mingling replaced by quick waves and hurried retreats inside, everyone protecting themselves from further entanglement. I became a minor celebrity and pariah simultaneously. The woman whose suspicion had solved the case, but also the reminder of what we'd all missed, what we'd all failed to see. Some thanked me quietly, others avoided eye contact, and I understood both reactions, the gratitude mixed with resentment that I'd shattered our collective denial. Detective Martinez visited occasionally, unofficial check-ins disguised as casual conversation over coffee at the diner 3 blocks from my house, where we could talk without audience. She told me about other cases, patterns she'd noticed in domestic violence that escalated to murder, warning signs that communities missed or ignored because intervention felt uncomfortable, felt like judgment. Margaret had been textbook, she said, the isolation, the control, the gradual erosion of self that made leaving seem impossible even when staying became fatal. I listened and learned, understanding that James hadn't been an anomaly but a type. One of thousands of men who believed ownership of their partners extended to the right to destroy them. Each story Martinez shared added weight to my growing conviction that silence was complicity, that comfort was a luxury purchased with other women's blood. By winter, the house had finally sold. A young couple from Ohio who'd gotten it at a significant discount and claimed they didn't believe in ghosts, that they could handle the history, if it meant affording their dream home. I watched them move in with their matching enthusiasm and ignorance, their laughter echoing across the fence as they painted walls and planned futures, and I wanted to warn them about the shadows that would never quite disappear, but I stayed silent, understanding that some lessons can't be taught, only learned, that they'd have to discover on their own whether love could override the memory of violence embedded in those walls. They introduced themselves, Jake and Emma, so young and hopeful it hurt to look at them. And when they asked about the previous owners, I simply said there'd been a tragedy, and left it at that. Some stories aren't mine to tell, even when they've become tangled with my own. Spring brought Margaret's family back to town, her sister Rachel requesting a meeting that I accepted with trepidation, unsure what she needed from me or what I could possibly offer. We met at Margaret's grave, a simple headstone now marking where she rested officially, far from the shed where she'd been hidden like trash rather than mourned like a human being. Rachel looked so much like her sister it stole my breath. The same green eyes and determined chin. But where Margaret's expression had carried worry, Rachel's held fury barely contained beneath professional composure. She thanked me for speaking up, for trusting my instincts when others had dismissed their concerns. And then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Had I seen signs? Had Margaret reached out? Had there been opportunities to intervene that I'd missed? I told her the truth. About the arguments I'd heard but not reported. About the bruises I'd noticed but not questioned. About all the small moments that had seemed innocuous until they weren't. Rachel didn't blame me, which somehow made it worse. Her forgiveness feeling unearned when I'd failed her sister in ways both action and inaction. She explained that Margaret had been planning to leave, that she'd been secretly saving money and consulting divorce lawyers, that she'd been closer to escape than anyone knew. The timing was cruel, weeks away from freedom when James's violence had stolen every future she'd been carefully constructing. Rachel showed me photos on her phone. Margaret smiling in ways I'd never seen next door. Authentic joy rather than the performed contentment I'd observed across the fence. She'd been a person, complex and full and deserving of life. Not just a victim or a cautionary tale, but someone who'd loved mystery novels and made terrible puns and dreamed of traveling to Iceland. The humanization was devastating, transforming Margaret from symbol into individual, making her loss feel more profound and more personal. We talked for hours beside that grave, Rachel sharing stories that painted her sister in vibrant colors, while I listened and laughed and cried for a woman I'd known only as a neighbor. She told me Margaret had mentioned me, had said I seemed kind, had fantasized about asking me to coffee if she ever worked up the courage to admit what was happening at home. The revelation broke something in me. This knowledge that connection had been so close, that friendship might have been the lifeline that pulled her to safety. But speculation was torture, and Rachel gently redirected when she saw me spiraling, reminding me that James alone was responsible, that his choices had killed Margaret, not my failure to somehow magically intuit her danger. We exchanged numbers before parting, a promise to stay in touch that felt both healing and painful, a way to keep Margaret's memory alive while acknowledging the circumstances that had brought us together. The whisper still haunted me, but its meaning had shifted through understanding. No longer just James's disturbing confession, but a reminder of how men like him viewed women, as resources to be acquired and replaced when damaged or difficult. I channeled my rage and grief into volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, using my story to help others recognize warning signs, to validate their fears, and support their escape. The work was exhausting and necessary, each woman who walked through those doors carrying Margaret's face in my mind, each success feeling like partial redemption for the one I'd failed to save. I learned to recognize the patterns, the cycle of abuse that trapped victims in increasingly dangerous situations, and I understood that Margaret had been caught in machinery designed to destroy her, that her death was predictable to anyone trained to see it. The system had failed her long before I had, but knowing that didn't erase my responsibility to do better next time. By summer's end, I'd become someone new, forged by trauma into a person who refused to look away, who trusted her instincts over social comfort, who spoke up even when silence would be easier. The house I'd loved felt different now, its walls thin membranes rather than protection, its proximity to the Holloway house a permanent reminder of how close evil could live without detection. I considered moving, starting fresh somewhere without ghosts, but staying felt important, necessary, a way of bearing witness and refusing to let Margaret be forgotten. Jake and Emma next door remained blissfully unaware of the depth of darkness their home had hosted, their laughter still ringing out on warm evenings, and I envied their ignorance while protecting it. Some people deserved to live without the weight of knowing what I knew. To exist in a world where homes were just structures rather than potential crime scenes, where neighbors were friendly rather than potentially fatal. The anniversary arrived with autumn leaves falling like confetti at a funeral, marking 1 year since Margaret's body had been discovered, and everything had changed forever. The media called, wanting follow-up stories, updates on how the neighborhood had healed, sound bites about moving forward that felt obscene in their simplicity. I declined every request, understanding that healing wasn't linear, and closure was a myth invented by people who'd never lost anything that mattered. Instead, I visited Margaret's grave alone, leaving the yellow roses that had been her favorite, speaking to the earth about the woman buried beneath it. I told her about the shelter work, about the women I'd helped escape men like James, about how her death had become a catalyst for my purpose, if not my peace. The one-way conversation felt necessary, a way of acknowledging debt and declaring intention, a promise that her story wouldn't end with her burial. Detective Martinez called that evening, her voice carrying news I hadn't expected. James had been attacked in prison, a violent confrontation with another inmate that had left him hospitalized with serious injuries. Part of me felt satisfaction at cosmic justice, at karma delivered through a fellow prisoner's fists, but a larger part felt empty, understanding that violence only created more violence, that revenge was a hunger that could never be satisfied. She didn't ask how I felt about it, and I appreciated her restraint, the recognition that my emotions around James were too complex for simple labels of joy or sympathy. We talked instead about her caseload, about other Margarets she was trying to save, and I heard the exhaustion in her voice, the weight of carrying so much darkness while trying to shine light. Before hanging up, she thanked me again for trusting my instincts that Saturday morning, and I understood that gratitude was the thread connecting us, two women changed by proximity to murder. Rachel and I had become unlikely friends, our relationship built on shared grief and determination to find meaning in senseless loss. She'd started a foundation in Margaret's name, funding domestic violence prevention programs and legal aid for women seeking escape from dangerous partners. I volunteered with the organization, speaking at fundraisers about my experience as the neighbor who'd noticed too late, using my story to encourage others to speak up sooner. The work felt sacred, transforming trauma into action, horror into hope, using Margaret's death to prevent others from meeting the same fate. We planned a memorial event at the community center, inviting everyone who'd known Margaret to share memories and commit to watching for warning signs, turning our neighborhood's shame into collective responsibility. The turnout exceeded expectations, evidence that people wanted to do better, to be better, to honor Margaret by protecting the living. Jake and Emma next door announced they were expecting a baby, their joy radiating across the fence in waves that should have felt infectious, but instead triggered something dark in my chest. I imagined a child growing up in that house, playing in the yard where Margaret had been buried, living unaware of the violence that had saturated those walls with suffering. But I swallowed my discomfort and offered congratulations, understanding that life persisted despite death, that innocence could reclaim spaces where evil had briefly flourished. Emma asked if I'd babysit sometime, and I surprised myself by agreeing, seeing it as an opportunity to protect rather than a burden to avoid. Perhaps this was healing, accepting that the house was just a house, that new memories could overlay old horrors, that Jake and Emma's love story didn't have to be poisoned by the tragedy that had preceded them. The final hearing brought closure of the legal kind, if not the emotional variety, the judge denying James's appeal and affirming that he would die in prison for what he'd done. I didn't attend, having said everything I needed to say during the trial, having no desire to see his face or hear his voice ever again. Instead, I spent that day at the shelter, helping a woman named Patricia escape a marriage that was trending toward the violence that had killed Margaret, using my experience to save a life in present tense rather than mourning one lost in past. As I drove her to a safe house with her 2 children sleeping in the back seat, I felt the whisper finally begin to fade, its power diminishing with each mile between Patricia and her abuser. James had thought he could claim me, replace Margaret with me as though I were an object without agency or choice. But he'd been wrong in every way that mattered. I chose my own path now, forged in the fires of witnessing tragedy and emerging determined to prevent it, to be the neighbor who notices, who speaks up, who refuses to let comfort override conscience. The house next door would always carry shadows, but I'd learned to live with ghosts, to honor the dead by protecting the living, to transform the whisper from haunting into battle cry.